The button. Good afternoon and welcome to today's Licensing Committee meeting. I'm Councillor James Cole, Chairman of this committee. There are no longer any formal restrictions regarding COVID, but the Council is continuing to adhere to safe working arrangements. I'm getting a little feedback. I think someone might not have turned off there. Thank you. Including the recommendation that individuals continue to wear a mask when not seated. Colleagues should also continue to use the cleaning materials provided to clean your desk, chair, keyboard and mouse, as this will help reduce risk. I'm supported today by the Vice Chairman of this committee to my right, Councillor Phil Barnett. The other members of the committee who are Councillors Steve Arder-Walter, Chef Beck, Graham Bridgman, Billy Drummond, Clive Hooker, Tony Linden, David Marsh, Graham Pask and Martha Vickers. Mrs. Julia O'Brien, Mrs. Amanda Ward are in attendance on Zoom, will be advising the meeting. Mrs. Moira Fraser is likewise advising the meeting and she is in the chamber. James Button will also be joining us to talk through the taxi policy. Mr. Ben Ryan is in attendance as the clerk to the committee. Zoom host is Mrs. Vicky Yole. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube, so members of the public are able to follow proceedings. Please can I ask everyone present in the meeting area to make sure they switch on their microphones when invited to speak directly into them and switch them off when finished. Can I also ask you to make sure you put your mobile phones to silent and have turned the sound off now on your tablets. If we do hear the evacuation alarm this afternoon, we must leave the building immediately. Please proceed via the safe emergency exit route, which will be shown to us by the trained officers. Please follow any instructions given by the trained officers. The assembly point is the Newbury Station multi-storey car park. Anyone requiring assistance will be assisted accordingly by the trained officers. Do members have any questions about the way in which this meeting will be conducted before we proceed? No? Thank you. Apologies. I understand apologies have been received from Councillor Adrian Abbs. Do we have any other apologies? Nope. Sorry? You're all here. It's amazing. In which case, we have some minutes. Now, I wasn't around on this committee for a set of minutes on the 31st of January. Do I have any comments on these minutes? In which case, can I sign them?
Happy to propose that, Chairman. I was in the meeting.
Seconded, Chairman.
Everybody happy who was here? Excellent. Meeting of the 10th of May. I imagine we're all happy with that. Can I have a proposer?
Happy to propose him.
Seconder.
Yeah,
Thank you. All in favour? Thank you very much. I will sign these. As arising from those two-tier tariffs, this matter had been discussed by officers, been decided it would not be appropriate to include a two-tier tariff system. There is a potential issue of legal challenges to two-tier tariffs based on the Equalities Act. It can be reviewed once the new taxi policy has been adopted. At this stage, we should not do that. Declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest, please, members? No. Thank you. You're pointing me to Oh, yes, the screen. Thank you, Graham. What is your declaration of interest?
I don't have a declaration of interest. I just wanted to go back to the previous item, the two-tier tariffs question. Not that I want to suggest anything about two-tier tariffs, but I do think, members, that we may need to look at tariffs for, in other words, taxi fares sooner rather than later. You'll recall that we had a conversation with the trade about fares. We introduced a table of fares, and I do think with rising fuel prices and the effect that might have on the trade, that is something. Now, I don't think it sort of naturally comes up under any of the items on the agenda, but we will be having, I think, a taxi liaison meeting in the not very distant future. So I think it may be a good idea, because we don't want to have to go round, I suggest we don't want to have to go around another cycle to come back to another licensing committee meeting before we take it to executive, because executive from memory sets the fare regulation. So I just wonder what members might think about taking something out of the taxi liaison meeting straight to executive.
Any comments? Would speed things up.
Yeah.
So are we all agreed on that? Okay, in which case, thank you. Because that meeting is later this month. Okay. In which case, back to this agenda. Mr. Button. Is Mr. Button on screen?
I'm here, ladies and gentlemen, if you can hear me and possibly see me.
Certainly can.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. Do you want to say anything else about this item, Chair, or do you want me just to dive straight in?
I'd like you to dive straight in, and we'll comment and question afterwards.
Splendid. Thank you very much. My name's James Button. I'm a solicitor, and I am a licensing solicitor specialising in Hackney Carriage and private hire licensing. The Department for Transport issued new guidance in July 2020, which encouraged all local authorities with taxi licensing responsibilities to update their taxi and policy. And I was invited to assist you in that process. The policy that you have in your documentation tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is that draft policy aimed to go out to consultation. The 12-week consultation is proposed, which fits with government guidelines. And in drawing this up, I have aimed to provide a clear policy which will form the basis for not only your licensing decisions, but which will inform the public, the trade, and other members of your council, and of course, everybody else who has an interest in this activity. In doing so, I have attempted to use plain English, the idea being that it will be accessible to all, and whether you know anything about Hackney Carriage and private hire licensing or not, it should make sense. And I've also aimed for a clear split between the policy and then the conditions which will naturally flow from that policy. In your previous policy, there was some sort of confusion between the two. It is, I think, a logical document. We have the introduction, which is the explanation of what it's all about. Then I go on to talk about dual driver licenses. These are the licenses that you will grant to people to drive both a Hackney Carriage and a private hire vehicle, or I suppose more accurately, either a Hackney Carriage or a private hire vehicle, because they can't drive them both at the same time. And also reference to the private hire only licenses for those who undertake local education authority or social services contracts, which are a much more specific area of activity. Then move on to the policy for both types of vehicles, the Hackney Carriages and the private hire vehicles. And then finally, in the policy section, the policy relating to private hire operators, who are the people who take the bookings for the private hire vehicles. Then there are 6 appendices. Appendix 1 is the previous convictions policy, which is based on the policy that you adopted in 2019. Appendix 2 is the penalty point scheme. The aim behind this is to enable you as an authority to have a graduated response to transgressions and non-compliance, leading ultimately to a decision as to whether or not action should be taken against the license. Appendix 3 is the code of conduct for drivers. Just to explain the rationale behind that, Hackney Carriage and private hire legislation has some quirks, and one of them is that whilst you can attach conditions to a private hire driver's license, you can't attach conditions to a Hackney Carriage driver's license. Even where you can attach conditions, breach of a Hackney Carriage or private hire license condition is not a criminal offence. In most licensing fields that the local authority are involved in, non-compliance with a condition is a crime, but it isn't for taxi licensing, with the one exception of a private hire operator not complying with the conditions relating to their booking records. Because of that, and because of the fact that you're granting dual licenses, the aim of the code of conduct is to provide a cohesive and standard approach to the behaviour that is expected of those who are driving Hackney carriages and private hire vehicles. Non-compliance will lead to questions ultimately as to whether or not that person remains a fit and proper person to hold the licence. But before that, of course, you have the penalty point scheme that's detailed in Appendix 2. Appendix 4 are the conditions for Hackney carriage vehicles. Appendix 5 are the conditions for private hire vehicles. And then Appendix 6 are the conditions for private hire operators. Now, what I would ask you to do, ladies and gentlemen, is try to look beyond the formatting and possibly even the punctuation, although Julia and Moira have spent a lot of time polishing this, and really address any comments you might have to the content. Now, before we get to that point, I need to alert you to a small number of matters that you need to determine because there are options in the policy. And again, I'm very grateful to Moira for putting together this list based on discussions that I've had with both Moira and Julia, and also with Beth Varco, your solicitor. So if it's all right with you, Chair, I'd like to take you to those points first and then suggest that we open up the floor for any particular discussions that you might have, but I'm in your hands.
Makes sense to me.
Okay. In that case, in your committee report, could I first take you to page 30? Which, all being well, has a paragraph at the bottom numbered 1.6 general. And in there, the suggestion is, or the proposal is, that if a person over the age of 65 is granted a driver's license, that will only be granted for a 1-year period. But to prevent them being placed in an unfortunate situation and disadvantaged against those who are younger than 65, the suggestion is that for the next 2 years, they wouldn't have to pay a license fee, because the usual approach is a 3-year license. Now, that should avoid any question over age discrimination, but it will, of course, involve some additional cost. That cost is probably reasonably minimal, but it is a factor you need to consider. And what I would suggest is that that additional cost is part of the overall cost of administration and can be spread across all Hackney carriage and private hire dual driver licensees. in which case the increase in costs to those will be minimal, and the potential hardship served to those who are over 65 should be minimised. So that's the first question.
Hands up already. Shall we deal with these as we go?
Yeah, I'm entirely in your hands, Councillor. Yes, quite happy to do so.
Councillor Bridgman, you were up first.
Two comments on that proposal. Firstly, I took it that there would be an extra cost to licensing to do the work every year for the period after 65, rather than every 3 years. And after all, we do approach most licensing matters on a cost recovery basis. So I do wonder whether there should be a not substantial, and I take the point that the margin isn't substantial, but I just wonder whether there should be a reflection of the fact that after 65, a driver is having to apply every year, and that therefore licensing officers are having to do work every year. That's my first question. Second question is, I'm presuming that the way in which this is written, or at least the way in which the amendment proposal is written, I'm suggesting that it shouldn't be for years 2 and 3. It should be for the subsequent years, because presumably after 65, you're having to do it 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 70, and so on and so forth. So it's not just years 2 and 3, it's years 5 and 6, 8 and 9, and so on and so forth, because if you're applying that 3-year regime to most people and a yearly regime to everyone over 65, you just need to reflect that if we are making a discount. Thank you, Chairman.
I'm sure you're right on the second part. On the first part, I asked that question and was told that the PPP would be prepared to swallow it. Perhaps we can get some comments on that later. Councillor Pask.
Thank you, Chairman. When you reach a certain age, you have to renew your driver's licence every 3 years. That process is free. At least there is no cost involved to it, provided you meet the medical requirements. I would be strongly in favour that if drivers need to renew a licence every year, that they do so without charge to them. The question I have, however, is there an upper age limit that and I genuinely don't know the answer. I do know the answer. Tried to rent a car somewhere fairly recently to find that it wasn't quite as straightforward as it was a couple of years ago, entirely down to my age. And when you get to another age, it becomes nigh on impossible. So, I mean, is there an upper age limit legally by which a driver has to give up their right to drive a taxi? But
I believe there is, but I can't remember what it is. Mr. Button, can you enlighten us?
There is no upper age limit. And as long as you remain a fit and proper person, you can continue to drive a Hackney Carriage or private hire vehicle. However, I think in the way you've experienced, Councillor Pask, it may well be that the insurance becomes prohibitive over a certain age, or as drivers get older. But there's certainly no statutory upper age limit, no. And I think you'd be hard pressed to put one in simply as an arbitrary figure in your policy.
Right, Chairman, if I can come straight back on that, it is indeed to do with insurance, and absolutely I am not arguing for us to put anything about age into our policy. Definitely not. So to cut a long story short, Chairman, I propose that we do not charge for years 2 and 3 upon renewal.
Do we have a seconder, since that is a proposal?
I'm more than happy to second that, Chairman.
Shall we have a vote on this while we're at it?
Well, Chairman, I do make the point that it's not just years 2 and 3.
No.
It's got to be
Yes.
the second and third years of each 3-year
5
cycle.
and 6. Yes.
Sorry, Chairman,
It has to be so
as a
worded.
proposer, I did take that as read. Every 3-year cycle, years 2 and 3 of every 3-year cycle should be at no cost to the driver.
Clear?
Yeah.
Excellent. Vote, please. Councillor Walter, I missed you.
Thank you.
If you
Thank
wish
you,
to
Chairman.
speak on
And
the same
indeed,
thing.
Councillor Becker, likewise, I'm very happy if you want to go
Who's
first,
about to
Jeff. But
propose?
I was just going to basically second.
Yes.
you seconding.
The other point is, to the very best of my belief,
I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't hear what Councillor Beck was saying then.
first of all, to the very best of my belief, the charity commissioners restrict drivers from continuing to drive things such as buses and cars transporting people to hospital, etc., at the age of 80. Just for your information. But I'm quite happy to actually second the proposal which has just been set forward.
It's interesting. My father at 91 was still driving for Meals on Wheels and doling them out and climbing the stairs. I'm not entirely in favour of such age limits. I think the insurance aspect is sensible, and we do insist on sight of insurance documents. Councillor Walter.
Thank you, Chairman. I was following with interest the comments from the members to my right. I might have missed what you were saying earlier, James, but could you or could we just refresh ourselves on why we only wish to grant 1-year licenses after the age of 65 and potentially for a long time? If there's, given that there is a driving license restriction at a certain age, we don't know yet what, and given that the insurance world will impose maybe a gradual or a limit of its own, what is the value of this, and could we consider not insisting on 1 year only after that age?
You could certainly consider not going for a 1 year only one. The idea behind it is to ensure that there are regular checks on drivers, because a 3-year license allows a driver to drive unfettered for that period of time, obviously. And as age creeps up on people, and it's creeping up on me just as much as it is on everybody else, the concern is that you have a driver who may not even know that they have a medical issue, driving the public around. And the idea is that there should be a regular, basically an annual medical check. And the way to ensure that happens is to grant a 1 year license. You could continue to grant 3-year licenses until a later age, for example, 70, which is when the DVLA license has to be renewed. All this is in your hands, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, James. That's a very feels a good rationale for doing it.
So, does that change our view?
Chairman, I hadn't realised that at all. I think we should align ourselves with DVLA. It makes total sense to do that. I didn't know that 65 was, dare I call it, an arbitrary age. So I'm going to amend my proposal to see if it finds favour that we do this from the age of 70 every year with no charge to the driver every second and third year.
An amended proposal. In which case, I'm very happy with that myself. Could we have a vote on that, please? All hands. We have Councillor Linden.
Yes.
Are you in favour of this, or?
Yes.
You are. So your hand was not actually raised, but fine. I think that's all in favour. Mr. Button.
Sorry, Chair, I was just making a note of that because we'll need to make amendments, but that's fine. I've got that. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that. If we can move on, not very far, to page 32. Top 2 paragraphs of page 32. This is, again, as a result of a peculiarity in taxi licensing and its legislation. The licenses are all granted for a finite period of time. As we've just heard, usually a driver's one is 3 years, a vehicle one is a year, and a private hire operator's license can be for a maximum of 5 years. What the legislation lacks is a mechanism to address renewal of those licenses. The legislation anticipates renewal because you can refuse to renew any of those licenses, but there's no renewal process within the legislation. Now, most licensing regimes contain a provision whereby where a license is expiring or due to expire, provided the application to renew it has been made before expiry, the current license is deemed to continue on the same terms and conditions until the renewal application is determined, in which case the renewed license is backdated to the date of the expiry of the old one. So you have a continual process. That is lacking in taxi licensing legislation. So you need to have a mechanism within your policy. Now, this relates to drivers, and the question you need to answer or decide upon is whether you want to have an approach which says, if the license has not been issued before expiry of the current license, then that driver cannot drive a Hackney carriage or private hire vehicle until that new license has been issued, which is quite lawful, but is seen by some as being overly rigid. Or the alternative proposal, which is the one in my document is in red, I don't know whether it is in yours, is that provided they've applied to renew before expiry of the current license, if the renewal license is not going to be issued and processed before expiry, the authority would issue a short-term license expressly issued without prejudice to any subsequent decision the authority may make for a period of, suggested here, a month, to enable the renewal application to be processed, and also to enable that driver to continue driving, and therefore there'll be no break in their ability to work. Now, there's no right or wrong answer to this. Authorities across England and Wales take varying approaches, but it is a matter for you to determine. And that's the point of the second question that you're being asked tonight. Which of those approaches would you like to determine or to decide upon?
Thank you. Councillor Bridgman's hand up immediately.
Chairman, thank you. I think to some extent I'd like to be guided by officers a little, because obviously the proposal is not to set a date by which a renewal application has to be made. It simply talks about sufficient time for it to be processed. So I'd like some understanding of what our processes, how long our processes take, because I would like to see let's say that, because after all, a driver knows that his or her license is going to expire, and therefore knows they need to apply for a new one, and they'll have that knowledge as soon as the current one's been issued. They know that it's going to expire in 3 years, or 1 year if they're over 70. And therefore they know when they need to apply for the new one. So if we had let's say it's a month or 2 months or whatever it is before the expiry that they have to apply by, and as long as they've applied by that date, then if it's our issue because we haven't done our administrative processes in order to decide whether or not to grant them a fresh license, I would say that their old license continues until we make that decision. I wouldn't worry about a month or whatever period it might be. I would simply allow the old license to continue until our officers make a decision. But I do want that tied, I think, to a date by which they need to apply in order to make it very clear to anybody what the process is. And if they apply late, well, they've only got themselves to blame if it runs out. Thank you.
Chair, could I just interrupt there? And it's important that there's no ability to let a license that has an expiry date on it continue. You have to have a process to issue a new license. Otherwise, that person is not licensed. They won't be insured. And, all the consequences that flow from that.
I come back and just ask you that, therefore, the license let's call it a temporary license. I know it's not, but let's call it that. The license that is issued has to be for a finite period of time. That's correct?
It does.
Therefore, I would suggest, Chairman, therefore, I take entirely the point Ms. Button's making, that rather than effectively say the old one continues, monthly licenses are granted until such time as officers make a decision. And if that decision is not to renew for whatever reason, the current, and I'm calling it temporary, license that's issued comes to an immediate conclusion. Mr. Button, would that work?
Yes, I think it would.
Councillor Pask.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I had a question which I think effectively has been answered. I'm in broad agreement with Councillor Bridgman. Certainly in the aviation industry, there's a personal responsibility to ensure that you are licensed. If there is an administrative problem in the timing of that renewal, then I'm all for giving a little latitude, but only, and I think this is the case as Mr. Button and Councillor Bridgman have bottomed out, that if they have applied in time, they should be granted this temporary license or this temporary extension to the license, which I would be very relaxed about us doing. But it is the absolute responsibility of any driver, as it is with any airline pilot, to ensure that they are properly licensed to do the job in which they are employed to do, or which they are undertaking.
So as long as they apply in time.
Yes, as long as they apply. And the only question I would have is, do we send out even an email reminder saying your license expires in 1 month's time or 3 weeks' time or whatever?
What is applying in time?
What is applying in time? Yes, I think we need to get to the bottom of that one as well. But I think in reality, the drivers are employed to do a job with fare-paying passengers, members of the public, and therefore there is a personal responsibility. If it's an administrative slowing down of the process, I'm all for giving a little latitude, but they must apply. And do we have a responsibility, or is it a good idea even if we do send out a reminder 3-4 weeks, whatever the period that people think is right, before the expiry of that license? Because if it's granted for 3 years, time flies by, and do you remember? If you get my drift, I think we get reminders for our car tax, don't we? We get reminders for our driver's licenses from the DVLA. I think it's a reasonable suggestion.
I can see that Sean Murphy is going to provide us.
Yeah, Chair, I do believe that reminders are sent on the Julia. That's my understanding. So effectively, I think to make this policy work, I guess what we need is a date by which we would expect them to have put that application in for renewal. And then obviously, as been suggested, basically, if it's not in by that date, that's a very different situation to us having an administrative backlog or taking some time to determine it for some other reason. But the drivers certainly do get reminders, Julia. I don't know how early they're sent out, but we can certainly look at the timeliness of that reminder, or the timing of that reminder, sorry, based on the decision about when we would expect people to apply before the current licence expires.
Well, I'm delighted with that response, Chairman. I hoped it would be that, and it is. I therefore think that we should grant, if there is an administrative delay, a period of, I'm going to test the water with 1 month latitude for extending their current licence whilst it is determined by this authority.
And there could be a further month if there's further administrative delay.
Well, yes. I mean, if it isn't their fault, it's our fault,
yes,
then we should give them that latitude, Chairman.
Excellent. Councillor Bartlett.
Well, on the back. Oh, sorry. Was he?
Councillor Beck, we'll bring you in first. Is your microphone on?
Thank you, Chairman. I agree with everything that's been said by members. The only point which I think possibly we need to address is that the text in red will obviously have to be modified to accord with what we are proposing. But I think we need to clarify that this extension of the existing license will be without charge. There's no mention of whether it's how much it is or whatever, and I think that ought to be clarified if other members agree, and the officers, of course. Thank you.
Without charge and not taken out of the ensuing year, 3 years, whatever it may be.
If I can come back on that last point, Chair, if I may, I think that the full license, as opposed to the temporary license, which is what we're talking, which was the phrase Councillor Bridgman coined, which I think is a very good one, I think should be backdated to the date of expiry of the previous license, because otherwise, especially if there's going to be no charge for this, and I agree there shouldn't be, that's my view, some people will benefit from the administrative delay.
There's no justification to do so. Fine, happy with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Barney, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, whilst welcoming Graham Pask leniency, if you like to use that phrase, Councillor Pask, I'm just wondering what would be a sensible period leading up to the final conclusion of the existing licence. I suppose the question to officers, what would be a sensible turnaround period? It's okay giving a reminder, but if you give a reminder very close to the termination period, that's not very useful at all. But if one was to give a period which would be sensible and appropriate for officers to be able to process an application, then I think probably we wouldn't need to be quite so lenient regarding that extra period. Perhaps you could ask that question, Chairman, of Sean. Yeah.
I don't know what the current period is. Maybe Julia can enlighten us on that. But I think probably a period of probably about something like 28 days sounds reasonable. I don't know what we currently work to, but obviously a lot of licensing renewals have dealt with in a much shorter period than that. But there are times of peak, kind of capacity issues, and there are times as well when people are off, or there are simply applications that take longer to deal with because there's follow-up information required. But Julia, have you got a thought on that? My feeling would be 28 days. Seems 28 days from before the due date.
Yeah, currently we are sending renewals out about a month before, and
Okay.
also depending roughly when the date of somebody's renewal is, it may be slightly less than that, but we could certainly look at doing that probably 2 months before.
Yeah.
Maybe asking them to get the applications in at least 28 or 30 days before the expiry of the licence. Our normal turnaround time is a maximum of 5 days. So we would hope that this situation wouldn't arise in terms of an administration issue on our part, certainly.
So maybe a month before with a to allow us basically then a 14. A month before, basically, they could get that in. That should allow us plenty of time to get the application out, assuming that everything basically is, everything is up to date.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chair, could I make a suggestion there? That they can apply between a month and 2 months and a month before expiry. But if the application is made within a month of expiry, they may not have the license. So your cutoff date is that month before. So that gives you a plenty of time. The reason I suggest that is that there are issues with the DBS checks. DBS issues ebb and flow. At the moment, there are some significant delays in parts of the country. It seems to be partly geographic, but not entirely. Really echoing what Councillor Pask said, as you know, in almost every walk of life where you need to have an authorization to work, it is that person's responsibility to make sure that that authorization is in place. And I suppose I ought to declare a vested interest here. I have exactly the same with the Solicitors Regulation Authority. If I haven't got my practicing certificate issued by the date of expiry, then that's it. There's no leeway whatsoever. So I think having a clear period during which they can apply, so you don't get people trying to apply 6 months early, but equally you've got a decent length of time between your closing date and the expiry. And if they miss that, then you don't issue the temporary license. If they have got it in that time, and there are administrative issues, even that take longer than the month or the 28 days or whatever you decide on, then, that's when the temporary license would come in.
That sounds good to me. Councillor Bridgman and Councillor Beck, got your hands up. Councillor Bridgman, I think, was first.
Chairman, thank you. I reflect on that. I think I would suggest a subtle difference. I'll see what Mr. Button thinks about this. Firstly, obviously, we need not just to look at the words in red. We also need to look at some of the words in black, because we need to introduce something about the timescale for application and the date by which an application has been. And I take the point about having an earliest date at which an application could be made, because you don't want them coming in 6 months before and having to stick them in a drawer somewhere. So I would suggest that it's the final paragraph on page 31, something along the lines of application for renewal license must be made no earlier than X. Because we keep on having issues with, I would say, clear working days. That way we avoid just working days. That way we avoid the issue of Christmas and bank holidays and holidays and whatever. So I would suggest 20 working days, 40 working days the earliest, 20 working days the deadline, effectively 2 months and 1 month before the existing license expires. And then if not, it's treated as a new application. Now, that then means that we don't need the wording. This is the question for Mr. Button, because obviously there's a wording here which anticipates someone applying after their old license has expired and looking for that to be backdated. So effectively, that whole question of the SRA, and I'm in the same regime as Mr. Button on the SRA and the cutoff dates, doesn't apply here. According to this wording, you can actually apply after your license expired and ask for it to be treated as a renewal. So I just think we need to bottom that one out. So if we are saying there is an absolute deadline, if you haven't applied by 20 working days before, it's treated as a new application, then fine. But let's make that decision. And then you would need to amend the words in red to make it clear that if the council hadn't made its decision by the time that it needed to, then you get rolling monthly licenses until such time as the council makes its decision. And when the council makes its decision, that is backdated so that you don't have an issue with fees. I take entirely the point Councillor Beck made about not charging for these rolling monthly license applications so that the fee comes back. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Button.
Thank you, Chair. The only issue with that, Councillor Bridgman and ladies and gentlemen, is that unfortunately there is a High Court decision, Exeter and Sandal, where the High Court decided that in exceptional circumstances, a licence that had expired could be renewed. There are two criteria for that. Firstly, the application to renew has to be made in a short period of time after expiry. And secondly, there have to be extremely good reasons why that application was delayed. Now, I wouldn't suggest putting that element in your policy. This is a policy. If somebody comes along saying, look, I was, due to apply, I got it all ready, I got it all set up to apply within 25 working days, which falls within the suggestion you made, Councillor Bridgman, of expiry. And then I had a heart attack or something like that. I was taken into hospital. I was incapacitated. I came out of hospital the day the license expired, came into the office the next day and made the application. Then in those circumstances, what I would say is, my advice would be, right, that's a situation where it is reasonable to depart from the policy. Departures from policy don't have to be written into the policy, but you would depart from that policy to accord with the legislation, to accord with the case law. So that's the point I would make on that. And the other point, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, when all the questions have been answered, would you as a committee be happy for myself and the officers to finalise the wording rather than spend possibly significant amounts of time this evening discussing how the wording should be? I don't mean to be rude by that in the slightest, but that may be a more efficient use of your time and possibly our time than debating that tonight. But I'm in your hands on that second point.
Thank you. Councillor Pask.
I'm all in favour, Chairman. I think what has been suggested is eminently sensible. We clearly have to comply with legislation. We should have a clear policy. If legislation overrides that for the reasons as Mr. Button has just illustrated, so be it. I'm fully in favour of officers coming up, taking account of our wishes.
Councillor Beck. Right. Is it reasonable to say that we have a general agreement on the change that should be made? No disagreement? Okay. Do you need a proposal that we put this to officers to rewrite the clause?
I formally propose, Chairman.
I'll second, Chair. Thank you. All in favour? All agreed.
Thank you. Moving on, page 36. There were 2 points here, which I think you can probably consider together. Training in disability assistance and training in relation to safeguarding, child sexual abuse and exploitation, or CSAE as it's now referred to. It was CSE until a couple of years ago, and then I think somebody woke up to the fact that that's what used to be a qualification, of which I have some. So they've now decided to make it CSAE, and also county lines training. Now, the question is, do you want that training to be renewed or updated, probably more accurately, every 3 years, which would tie in with the renewal of the driving licence, or every 6 years, which would be every other renewal of a driving licence? It is a matter, again, for you, although I think the general view is that these matters are serious, they are significant, and our understanding as a society of them is developing quite rapidly. So I would suggest that the 3 years is the more appropriate period of time, but it is in your hands.
Privilege. I entirely agree. One thing reading through this that I had quite strong feelings on, that we should be going for 3 years. For what it's worth, Bracknell also went for 3 years on this. Does anybody wish to comment? Councillor Pask, your hand is up.
It is. And Chairman, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, these guidelines and I think they are guidelines, aren't they? These training guidelines do change, sadly due to circumstances, I mean, that hit the headlines. I think every 3 years is eminently sensible. My question was just going to be, what form does this training take? I mean, if it's a whole day somewhere incarcerated, that is quite a commitment. If it's a computer-based one or a question-answer session, that might be simpler. What form does this training normally take on renewal?
Mr. Button?
I'll have to defer to your officers on that, because it is a matter for them to determine what the training consists of. And again, it may vary from time to time.
Thank you, Chair. If you're happy for me to answer. Currently, the training is done either virtually or in person, and it's done and it lasts roughly 3 hours. But that's certainly something, and we're intending to bring that training in-house, so officers will be delivering that, and obviously with time we can maybe look at how we do that differently.
I think 3 years then, Chairman.
And if this comes in-house, there's presumably no cost to the drivers.
Madam Chairman.
Right. Councillor Vickers.
Chairman, yes, I definitely agree that this should be 3 yearly. I'm not quite sure where the 6 years came from, as that seems an awfully long time. Lots of things change in that period, so definitely at least 3 yearly. And the training should be interactive in some way. Certainly couldn't be just putting in something online. It should involve talking to other people, sort of reacting, making out in group sessions, that sort of thing. So it should definitely be interactive.
That point about interactive, Julia, if we're bringing it in-house, we should be able to take that into account.
I'm terribly sorry, Chairman. I didn't actually hear Councillor Vickers when she was talking.
She was making the point that the training should be interactive and not just filling in a form on a computer.
Yep, absolutely. That's what we insist on at the minute. So that's currently what we do. And if you're happy for us to continue that, then obviously that's what we can continue with.
Could it be interactive?
Oh, yes. We make sure that the drivers are very much participating. Yeah, absolutely.
Councillor Baggs, your hand up. No.
3 years is, in my view, the only option available to us. 6 years is far too long.
Right. Can I have a proposal? Is that a proposal, Councillor Bagg?
Yes.
Second, please. Councillor Walter, all in favour? All agreed. Right. Mr. Button.
Thank you very much, Chair. Right, moving on, we now move to page 56. This is the previous convictions policy. Before we get to 56, on page 53, at paragraph 4.1, as it reads at the moment, it says applicants can discuss what effect their offending history may have on any application by contacting the licensing service in confidence for advice. That conflicts with the wording actually in the policy itself, the main taxi policy. So I would suggest removing the words in confidence. The reason is for that, not so that this can all be bandied about, but so that an officer who has that interview or that discussion with a potential applicant can then in turn discuss it with their colleagues, the legal team, and so on. Because if those words remain, obviously it would mean that only that officer would have that knowledge, and that defeats the purpose. So just removing those words in confidence, if possible, in paragraph 4.1 on page 53.
Members?
Proposed, Chairman.
Yep. Seconded. Thank you. All in favour? Agreed.
Thank you. Then moving to page 56, paragraph 5.4, which is at the bottom of the page. At present, it reads, in relation to single convictions, the following time period should elapse following completion of the sentence, or the date of conviction if a fine was imposed, or completion of any disqualification from driving, before a licence will be granted. Now, a sentence, if you're sentenced to imprisonment, you're sentenced to 2 years. That is the sentence. But because if that person then behaves themselves, they're likely to be let out on a prison licence, and the potential for confusion here is significant, after a year. Just to make it clear that it isn't after the year when you're released for good behaviour that the time runs. It is after the completion of the sentence, which is the 2 years you were sentenced to insert the words at the beginning of that bracket, which says, where at the moment it says, or the date of conviction, to insert the words, meaning the period of imprisonment imposed, comma, not simply the time served, comma.
Members? Councillor Bridgman.
I don't think the wording completely works, and I'll explain why. At the moment, even with the amendment, in relation to a fine, the date of conviction, if a fine was imposed, but of course, and I looked at Mr. Button's expertise on this, so if a fine was imposed or completion of any disqualification from driving, is it not possible that a fine and a disqualification from driving could be imposed? And shouldn't we always be looking for the end point, the furthest away date, whatever that is? If there's a conviction and a period of imprisonment, then yes, I entirely agree that it should be end of that period of imprisonment, not the date of release, if the release comes earlier. But whatever is the longest period, we should be working from that. Because my concern with having words, if a fine was imposed, then the argument would be, well, a fine was imposed, therefore it's the date of conviction. Yes, I was disqualified from driving, but that doesn't count because a fine was imposed. So I'd just like to tidy this up a little.
Okay,
but I agree with the point that's been made about the wording.
Chairman, can I ask a question before I have a question which I would like to pose as carefully as I can, of course, as always, but does this point relate to all convictions or just driving convictions?
All convictions, Councillor, in accordance with the policy.
Right. So, for example, murder or rape, anything like that?
Yes, and no, although the policy says that in those circumstances you'll never grant a licence.
Okay, right. Well, what I was going to go on to say with sensitivity, Chairman, is clearly all our drivers in West Berkshire are fine, upstanding citizens, I appreciate, but elsewhere in the country we have had issues where heinous crimes have been committed. But as long as we are covered with that, I have no debate about what Councillor Bridgman has just said about serving the time. Sorry. Yes, the amended wording, meaning the period of imprisonment imposed, not simply the time served. And I take the point about the convictions, the loss of licence as well. Thank you, Chairman, for the clarification.
Okay. Anybody else? Mr. Button?
I think that it's a point well made by Councillor Bridgman, and I was literally just trying to make a note to alter that in accordance with what we've already agreed. So yes, I'd be quite happy with that, Chair.
On you go then.
You want to take
done that one, right? Moving to page 61. This is in the penalty points scheme. Penalty points can be imposed by an officer, but there is an appeal mechanism. If somebody feels aggrieved by the imposition of those points, they need to have an internal appeal scheme, because this isn't a statutory scheme. There's no possibility of appealing the imposition of points to the magistrates' court. The question is, should that be determined by appealing to a senior officer or to the licensing committee or subcommittee thereof? The advantage of it going to an officer is that it is potentially quicker. The advantage of it going to the councillors is there is a perceived independence from officers, although obviously you're all the same organisation. A senior officer is likely to have been responsible in a managerial capacity for the officer who imposed the penalty points. There may be viewed to be some bias as a result of that. The other advantage of it going to the committee, as opposed to an officer, in my view, is that it enables you as councillors to appreciate the quantity and scope of transgressions. I take the point that was made a moment or two ago that all West Berkshire drivers are without any issues whatsoever. But seriously, if these appeals do not go to members, then it is possible for yourselves as councillors to fail to recognise that there are miscreants. It's probably the best way to put it. The other point on this is that the proposed policy says that if an appeal is launched, the appeal body, because you've yet to decide whether that's an officer or the committee, can uphold the imposition of points, reduce or remove the imposition of points, impose more points, or take action directly against the licence by means of suspension or revocation. And the question was raised in our discussions as to whether that was reasonable, that an appeal body could actually impose a greater sanction. I think the answer to that is yes. And the reasoning for that is that as councillors, you would hold, assuming or wherever the appeal goes, that is the body that then determines what imposition should be imposed. And if, for example, that officer or yourselves as councillors, if that's how you decide, think, well, actually, this is one where it should have been a bit more, then that is something that should be open to you. The other point that flows from that is that there needs to be not a deterrent to appealing. That's not what this is intended to be. But there needs to be a realistic acknowledgement of appealing. If there is no risk of any increased sanction, there is a risk, and this has been experienced by other authorities, that some drivers will simply use this as a mechanism to tilt at the council's windmill. And that is unnecessarily time-consuming and therefore expensive for everybody involved in that process. And by extension, because the costs of licensing are largely recovered through the licensing fees, unfair on the compliant drivers who would have to ultimately bear the costs of that increased process. So I hope I've explained that. If you'd like me to explain any of that any better, then please come back to me. But that's what the decision you need to make, or the two decisions you need to make.
Before I bring members in, I have a couple of questions. One of you, sir, if this was to go to committee, would it have to be the full committee, or would we be entitled to use a subcommittee?
Absolutely a subcommittee. I wouldn't suggest it going to the full committee at all. I would suggest a subcommittee.
Secondly, to Julia, how often in West Berks does this happen?
Currently, Chairman, there is we have no penalty point system. So such a decision at the minute wouldn't come to a subcommittee of members.
Have we got any feel for how often this might happen?
Not off the top of my head, I'm afraid, no. We could have a look at some decisions that we've made, but because it's a specific penalty point system that we're talking about now.
Talking about penalty points going over 12.
Yeah, so we could look at the more serious issues that we've had and have a feel for some numbers. I don't know whether Amanda can think of more numbers. I wouldn't say it's more than 10. I don't know, Amanda, but I am sort of picking numbers out of my head. It's really, well, it's obviously serious things and revocations that we'd be looking at.
Amanda?
Thanks, Chairman. The more serious ones directly go to the magistrates. Any right of appeal, we would direct them to the magistrates. In terms of minor misdemeanors that we licensing officers get, we do get complaints of possible dangerous driving or some of the things that are listed in the point system. So, I mean, as we've never done this with West Berkshire, it is a difficult one to say how many the potentially there may be. I think Bracknell's recently had one, so there's probably about, as Julia says, about 10 maximum.
Okay, members. Councillor Linden.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I mean, I would, if we do this appeals thing, it needs to be determined by officers first and then coming to an appeals afterwards if they disagree with that decision. And I know this is taxi licensing, but we tend to do it on our other appeals, that it tends to go on from officer determination to a final appeal to members on appeal panels. And that's the way we normally adopt it, rather than going straight to the members if it hasn't been determined by an officer. So just wanted to raise that point, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Adewalter.
Thank you, Chairman. Question perhaps to officers. How would this system, which looks to be an impressively long list of possible offences, and I'm guessing maybe with some inspiration from other authorities, how would it be policed and how frequently would somebody check and who would do the checking?
Thank you, Chairman. Would you like me to reply? So it would be a variety of things. So it would be potentially enforcement action that officers do when they're out and about. It would be possibly some complaints that we receive from members of the public or other people. It could be, for example, if the vehicle go for an inspection in one of the authorised garages, it may be something that there's something that is required on the inspection that they don't pass, which then comes back to officers. So a real variety potentially of issues and how we would pick them up. And then obviously we would look at the history of the driver that we're looking at, or the operator or vehicle, and then assess whether there would be penalty points being awarded. I don't know if does that answer your question?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Parsk.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I have a question too. And if I've missed something, do forgive me. We don't do this at the moment. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct, Councillor.
Why don't we do it? Are we having to do it in the future?
We don't do it currently because there's never been a system in place to do it. And as Mr. Button, I think, might clarify, this gives us more of a progressive enforcement option list. Perhaps Jim might want to say a bit more about that.
Yes, if I may, councillors and chair. This gives you a graduated response. The legislation allows you to suspend or revoke a licence or refuse to renew it. If you encounter, or your officers encounter, somebody who on one occasion, for example, is not wearing their driver's badge, obviously either suspension or revocation would be a disproportionate response on one occasion. So that would be a 3 points. They've still got 9 points or 3 similar lives left, if you want to look at it in that way. If they're found again, same thing happens. And then when they hit the 12, they would come automatically before the committee. That's not the appeal. That is for you to determine what action, if any, to take against their licence. And it demonstrates that they are not learning from their mistakes. Everybody can make mistakes. I think that's something we need to acknowledge. The question is, do you learn from your mistakes? If you do, then those 3 points have had their effect. The chap never forgets to put his badge on again, and you've got a simple, straightforward process. If they hit the magic 12 and you say, well, look, this has happened over the period of the last 3 months, you really aren't complying with your conditions of the license or the legislation, in fact, we're going to suspend your license for a period of, let's say, a fortnight, which I think would probably be reasonable. And they decide to appeal that to the magistrates court, which would be their right. Then at the magistrates court, it is a fresh hearing, a hearing de novo. The council has to justify its decision and explain its decision. And there is a clear graduated response. These points were awarded, and eventually, if you like, to put as many mixed metaphors into it as I can, that's the straw that broke the camel's back, and you took the action. So that's the first point. The second point is that this is specifically referred to in the DFT guidance issued in 2020. And they say that it is a good use of enforcement processes and ultimately local authority time, both in terms of officer time and member time. So incorporating this into your policy is following the DFT guidance.
Well, that's much clearer to my mind now, Chairman. I thank you, Mr. Button, for that explanation. And I see exactly now where you're coming from. My personal view, for what it's worth, is that we as members have to, we do determine, for example, appeals against home to school transport and a variety of things. I think it's a member responsibility. And I think whoever made the point initially that we are perceived as more independent from those who impose the penalties. Sorry, officers, but you know what I mean. And therefore, I would suggest, or I would favour at this point very strongly that these transgressions would come to a subcommittee of however many, 3 members or whatever, for determination. On hopefully the rare occasions it would happen in West Berkshire, Chairman.
Okay. Sean.
Thank you, Chairman. I was actually just really going to say that I agree with the position that James Button has set out. I myself feel that this is something that needs to come to members for a variety of reasons, not least of which it would be consistent with almost everything else we do in the licensing world, where there is a right to some independent review of the decisions of officers. So whether that's basically a review straight into the magistrates court, or whether basically that's a determination by the subcommittee now, it feels to be right that basically that whatever scheme we put in place, that there should be some form of right of appeal. And if there is no right of appeal, it probably ought to be to somebody within the authority, and that feels to me like it should be a subcommittee. So I was just going to add my view as an officer and the kind of service manager on that, if I, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Brisbane.
Chairman, thank you. I'm going to subtly disagree with Sean and with Councillor Pask in these terms. I think that there should be a 2-stage potential appeal. After all, the imposition of the points is an automatic process. You do something, you don't wear your badge, you're spotted this, spotted that, this has happened. It's automatic that there are a number of points. No officer is getting involved in that process. In a sense, they are imposing a table. So if the individual then wants to appeal that because she says, no, you didn't, I taken my jacket off and you spotted me without my badge, but I put my jacket back on the next moment and you didn't see me with my badge, so on and so forth. I think let's leave an officer, to a senior officer, to look at that. And I'm now making it akin to a home to school transport appeal. Yeah. After all, home to school transport goes through an officer stage 1 process before it goes anywhere else. So I think there should be a stage 1 appeal that goes to officer. Then a stage 2 appeal if the decision is upheld. And I would suggest that at this stage there isn't imposition of additional penalty. It's simply is it a correct decision or isn't it a correct decision? If it's upheld, then we have an appeal. I would suggest not to a licensing subcommittee, because after all, the licensing subcommittee is very much a creature of statute in a certain sense, in the way in which we deal with gambling and alcohol licensing.
We might have to call it something else.
Well, I think that we have an existing body that looks at appeals. We have the appeals panel, which deals with appeals and is used to dealing with appeals. We are used to hearing different types of appeals on all sorts of subjects. Officers present, respondent responds, body makes a decision. So given that I think we're going to have to look at the scheme of delegation in order to tie this one off anyway, whatever we do, my suggestion is that we should suggest to council that this is a matter for the appeals panel, not for the licensing subcommittee. But that's a personal view.
Councillor Parks, you were about to say something. You're going to disagree with him?
I wasn't going to disagree, actually, Chairman. I was going to concur. It seems eminently sensible.
Councillor Hooker.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is that the points are added to the offence. Any consideration of how long those points will stay on for? They roll on from licence to licence to licence until such time as you get 12 points, and then you'll lose or lose your licence. That's my question. How long do the points stay on for once you've picked them up?
The suggestion in the policy, Councillor, is that they remain live for 12 months from the date on which they were imposed or the date of any subsequent appeal at which they were either upheld or increased.
Thank you.
Happy with that? Okay, Councillor Beck.
Thank you.
Right. Sean.
Yeah, Chair, I just picking up on the point that Councillor Bridgman made. I can certainly see a place actually for a stage one review because I mean there could be something that is simply a mistake. So I can certainly see that. I'm just wondering, actually, going back to if we're going to go out to consultation on that basis, if that's a decision of the committee that we have a two-stage process, then I assume, James, that we would need to build that into the consultation process to explain what that might look like before it goes out to consultation. As Councillor Bridgman said, it will obviously need constitutional change anyway in due course.
Yes, I mean, I can build that into the consultation document with your officers. I can't alter your constitution. That's a different task. But certainly, in terms of the proposal and the consultation document, that myself and the officers can work that up.
Excellent. Changing the constitution is essentially Councillor Bridgman's task. He knows all about it. I think we need a proposal on this one. Do we agree this two-stage approach?
If I may, Chairman, I propose the approach I have suggested.
Okay. Seconded. All in favour? Agreed.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I just confirm? So that's stage one, appeal to officer. Stage two, appeal to the subcommittee, to the appeals committee.
It's technically the appeals panel, but don't let that worry you too much.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you. There is one final point, and this is one that I'm afraid, and I'm sorry to spring this on you, Moira, because it's not on your list, but it's something that I have been discussing with Julia. Looking at the history of Hackney Carriage licensing, this is only Hackney Carriage licensing in West Berkshire. You have two Hackney Carriage zones. You have the Newbury zone and you have the rest of the Borough zone. That is as a result of local government reorganisation in 1974. But all the licenses that you grant and have done for, if I'm right, Julia, we think about 20 years, have been for both zones. So there is no distinction between them, and you're effectively granting 2 licenses, one for the Newbury zone, one for the rest of West Berkshire zone, with the difficulties that that entails of having to have, in theory, 2 sets of bylaws, 2 sets of conditions, 2 sets of fair tariff, and so on. Now, as the licenses have been granted for both zones for a significant period of time, the suggestion is that as part of this process, you remove that zoning so that Hackney Carriage licenses, and it is only Hackney Carriage licenses, and I can explain why if you like me to, would be operative and would apply across the whole of your district, rather than in those 2 discrete areas, even though they haven't applied in those 2 discrete areas because you've granted licenses for both.
Councillor Bridgman.
Makes absolute sense to me, Chairman. But I do just want to bottom out with officers, because this was a question I was going to raise generally when we worked our way through the document, as to who really owns this document. The references in the report is to this coming back to the licensing committee after it's been around the consultation process. So I just want to make sure, from officers' perspective, that the legislation and the scheme of delegation gives this committee the power to do what Mr. Button's just suggested, which I entirely agree with, and to adopt this policy so that, it hasn't got to go somewhere else for final agreement. But I certainly, if we are able to do what has just been suggested, I certainly suggest we do it.
Okay, that's a proposal.
It is indeed, Chair.
Second, Councillor Hooker. All in favour?
Well, can I just confirm that that we have the power? I just want to make sure with officers that this licensing committee has this power.
Sean, comment?
I will check, but as far as I know, it does. Basically, yeah, I'm just looking in the Constitution now. Actually, Councillor Bridgman, as you talk, but I believe that matters relating to taxes are basically within taxes and private are within the remit of the committee. But I'll just check that. There's certainly council functions.
The task.
Well, Chairman, it does make eminent sense. I agree. And I think I'm looking to Councillor Linden, who has served a similar time to me, but I believe this is historical, where the Newbury taxis guarded their zone zealously. And this was relaxed some time ago. So I think it's a historical thing that we are looking at. And after 20 years, I think it makes total sense.
Good.
I'd concur, Chairman.
Okay.
Could I just suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that if it turns out that the constitutional issue means that it doesn't lie with your committee, could I suggest that following the consultation, assuming that you still remain in favour of that view, you would then make a recommendation to council to amend that, even if you can't do it. So you've still got a cohesive proposal.
We would.
Well, Chairman, if I may, I mean, the proposal is to take this out to consultation with all these amendments and everything else. And that is part, I think, of, technically, I suppose it's sort of part of the consultation. And it all comes back here as one global piece of work if it sits here, and it all goes back to council as a global piece of work if it sits there. So, wherever it needs to go to, it goes there and is dealt with.
Yeah. That's all right. Any other points, Mr. Button, that you would like to raise?
No, I have no other points, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for your time spent on those. I think certainly from my point of view, and I think from the point of view of the officers, although I hesitate to speak on their behalf, it's been time well spent.
Don't go away just yet. I've certainly got.
No, I'm not. Don't worry.
And Councillor Hooker, you've got your hand
Thank you,
up.
thank you. Mr. Button, just an interest, I've read through this document, I may have missed it. It might be totally superfluous, not an important point. Nowhere in there does it mention anything about the automatic locking of doors as a part of the driving service. Is that something would go in here? I mean, we go on to how everyone should look and you help in with the luggage and all that stuff.
It isn't mentioned, no. Some purpose-built vehicles have that mechanism built in, whereby when the taximeter is activated, the doors are locked, and this is to prevent bilking. Bilking is making off without payment at the end of the journey, which is a significant problem which the trade face on a sadly nightly basis. The issue of door locking is one that is difficult to address. On the one hand, from the point of view of the driver, you want to prevent people making off without payment. Equally importantly, if people have left your vehicle and are disgruntled, you want to be able to prevent them to get back in and possibly be abusive or worse. And I think as motorists, everybody feels that they want to be able to secure their environment. From the point of view of passengers, again, from the point in terms of being in a secure environment, I think that's equally important. If you are leaving a town centre at night, especially if there has been some incident, so for example, and this is one that has happened that I'm fully aware of, a lady had been assaulted and sexually abused by a man. She managed to run off, got to a Hackney carriage. The driver, having been on a safeguarding course, recognised that this was a lady in distress, got her into the vehicle and locked the doors as her attacker arrived and approached the vehicle, and being able to keep the doors locked while that vehicle was then able to safely leave and the police were called was an important safeguarding issue. So that all is in favour of the doors being able to be locked by the driver. The counter argument, of course, is that if it's the driver who is the abuser, then the passenger may well want to be able to escape. The problem is that it's a question of trying to address that balance. You will have views on that from the drivers, no doubt very strongly. You may have views on that from others, possibly equally strongly the other way. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but my feeling, and it is only a personal feeling, is that there are fewer issues arising from the driver being able to lock the doors than would arise if the driver was unable to lock the doors. Added to which, with modern central locking, modern, that makes me sound terribly old, but with central locking systems that are likely to be fitted on vehicles that you are likely to license, I don't know how you could disable the ability of the driver to lock the doors simply when passengers are in the vehicle. I think that would be a very difficult and potentially expensive modification, which I'm not sure would be a reasonable requirement.
I appreciate that. My point is, there's no mention at all of locking within the whole document. I mean, it's an extensive.
No. There isn't, and I think that's a fair point. It is again something that could be put in, but the difficulty, I think, is in trying to phrase it in a way which would cover everything that I've just said, whilst being not only comprehensive, but also comprehensible and enforceable. So again, I think in many cases, there are some things that are best left alone. If in the fullness of time, it becomes a major issue in West Berkshire, and I sincerely hope that isn't the case, then it might be something that you would want to revisit. But at this stage, I would be tempted to say, leave it as it is.
Thank you.
You're happy with that?
No, but I'll take that advice at this.
I'm sure, Mr. Button, if you come across a good way of wording it, you will put it in our direction.
If I do, Chairman, I will, yes.
Moira.
Chairman, just to say that in light of the discussion about the age of 65 and the medical checks, we will probably also need to amend the table on page 34.
Yes. Duly noted. Thank you. I had one question, which is page 43 in emission limits. Noting that they do not apply to stretched limousines, vintage cars, or novelty vehicles specified a fire engine. I get it as far as vintage cars are concerned, perhaps even novelty vehicles. I do not get it as far as stretched limousines are concerned. Why should we not have emission limits for stretched limousines, cut and shut, or whatever they are? Why do we not have emission limits? It feels wrong.
I think the reason, well, I don't think the reasoning behind that is because an awful lot of stretched limousines are vehicles which are reasonably elderly. Added to which, there aren't many stretched limousines in the grand scheme of things by comparison to your regular private hire vehicles. I'd be very surprised if they amount to 0.01% of your fleet. So the impact on the environment of allowing vehicles that are stretched limousines to be exempt from the emissions test is probably not particularly significant. Their use is much more akin to the novelty type vehicles than to regular private hire activity. And that's why it was suggested as an exemption. But as with all these things, it is up to you to decide whether you want to continue with that. Sorry, Councillor, what page were you on? Because, oh yes, I've got it. I found it. Sorry, because I was making a note of the last point when you mentioned it. Page 42. Yes, I found it.
Any comments, members? Are we happy to leave it?
Chairman, if I may, I'm just intrigued by vintage cars, because I just thought, hang on, what does vintage mean? It's apparently any vehicle built before 1930. So there's got to be pretty old. Classic. This is not classic cars. These are vintage.
That's cars. What it says. Well, I reckon that most stretched limos are not vintage under that definition, which is why I was unhappy with it. But for today, at least, I'll go along with it.
Chairman Top Gear had it last night.
Councillor, if I may, could I suggest that it is made clear that that would also apply to classic vehicles if there are ages, as Councillor Bridgman says, for veteran vehicles, for vintage vehicles, but there may well be people who would want to run, for example, and this is just an example, a 1960s Rolls-Royce, which is a classic car, as would be and this is more my area, a 1970s Cortina, rather than, you know, necessarily a vintage vehicle which dates prior to 1930.
But are you telling us, nevertheless, that the numbers are so small, we should let this go?
That is my feeling. I think it is highly unlikely that you're going to get somebody with a fleet of 200 1970s Cortinas who think, oh, this is a cracking wheeze to get around the emissions test. And again, the way the policy is worded is that the requirement can be waived, not that it will be waived, it can be waived. So if a complete smoking disaster turns up to be tested, you can decide not to waive your policy.
That will do me. Councillor Walter.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And Mr. Button, I apologise if you did cover this, but I was reflecting on a little bit, no, not on the same page. The second paragraph of the age section on page 42, which is the slightly broader point about emissions overall, and in contrast with novelty or vintage or stretch limousines, this is obviously the currently the majority of vehicles. The wording of that paragraph looks to me to be ambiguous, and I wonder if, in particular, as we should be giving a lead here and indicating our direction of travel on environmental grounds, we should tighten up that wording. And indeed, regardless, sorry, I think there are two cases: grant of a new license for a new vehicle, assuming there is such a thing, I'd suggest be Euro 6 rather than Euro 5. Why should Euro 5 be allowed unless there is a broader exemption which would get us into trouble or difficulty if we're trying to impose it? So perhaps, James, Mr. Button, could you just advise us briefly of what the law says now about Euro 5 and 6, and perhaps what it will say, and we should be anticipating in the coming 1, 2 to 3 years?
Right. The reason we suggest Euro 5 or Euro 6 is that Euro 6, and please, if one of the officers can correct me if I'm wrong, is for vehicles built since 2018. And to insist on that would be to have a very tight age policy, which may not be reasonable in the circumstances, which is why Euro 5, which I think, if I remember rightly, allows vehicles back to 2012. So that's effectively your 10-year age limit. If I've got those figures right, and if I'm wrong, please forgive me. To insist simply on Euro 6 would be to require a significant investment for new vehicles, which may deter entrance into the trade and those who wish to renew or to replace their vehicles. So that was the idea behind that, Councillor Walter.
Thank you, Chair. And if I may come back on that then, and I take the point. However, unless we're going to be, or maybe we are going to be reviewing this annually, it would be appropriate to set a signal that by either a date or within N years, we will be moving to Euro 6. In other words, while not disadvantaging drivers of older vehicles, to signal to operators more generally our preference for better higher standard of emissions. And again, some signal short of a prohibition might be a good way forward. Then, if you would advise us against a Euro 6 only rule at this stage.
We have to move into the green aspects as our next one anyway. So can I suggest we defer that? And the talk about doing it every year, one thing I want to see added to item 8 is a review of the green question annually. Right. Councillor Bridgman, your hand is up.
Yep, just to say I've looked it up, and Euro 6 came in for all new vehicles from the 1st of September 15.
Yep.
So it's been around a while.
But it would still cut out a number of our fleet, perhaps at a difficult point when nobody can buy any new vehicles anyway. Councillor Pask.
I was going to make the same point that Councillor Bridgman actually, indeed 2015, not 18. But come on, we've got to be realistic and practical. We've got to send the right messages. I'm not saying we don't, but we've got to be realistic, as you just said, Chairman, especially with the shortage of supply of new vehicles. I think we should revisit in a year or two.
Okay. Can we move on to the next item, please?
Chair, I was just going to make a suggestion. If when we get to the item about the policy on the greening effectively of the fleet, I just wondered, James, whether we could actually build into the policy that would be reviewed on an annual basis as part of the licensing committee's review of the greening of the fleet, rather than set it in stone permanently. Or would that be too vague?
To review your entire policy on an annual basis?
No, to just review the Euro 5 issue. If we are going to review the issue around green fleets each year as a committee, or the committee is going to review the issue around green fleets.
Yes, I mean, you can make that part of your policy and make it clear that the age and emissions will be reviewed on an annual basis.
Okay, then let's do that. Yeah. Can we move on to the next item, however? When we originally timed this, we estimated 3/4 of an hour for the item that we have just gone through. So we are running a little over time. Moira, are you introducing the next one?
I am, Chairman.
I don't know whether it's, sorry, Chair, I don't know whether it's my computer, but there's a fearful echo on everything that everybody's saying at the moment.
I think, Moira, you need to mute the laptop.
Are you muted on your own machine?
Chairman, I thought I was. Sorry, Chairman. Mindful of time, I'm going to cut my introduction very short. I'm going to assume that members have read the report and that you're comfortable with the history and the reasons for this report coming to the committee this evening. And also that members will have had a look at some of the options and policies of where this has been discussed in other authorities. But if anybody does become aware of any schemes that we haven't reflected in the policy, they could just email me, because this is something that we're going to keep on looking at on an ongoing basis. There will be a report going to the Environment Advisory Group in September to sort of feedback on what was discussed here this evening. And I also understand that there's a potential for a report going to the November Environment Advisory Group, which will be looking at the location and of the rapid charging points that is discussed within the document. As is always the case when this matter is discussed, and it's been discussed repeatedly at the Taxi Liaison Group meeting, at this licensing committee, and as well as the Environment Advisory Group, there are some elements over which this authority does have some control. So, for example, the fees is something that the West Berkshire Council can influence. And there are other elements such as the range of vehicles and the cost of the vehicles that obviously we don't have any control of. One of the things that it has come to light recently in discussions that I've had with one of the local taxi drivers is that they have recently purchased an electric vehicle, and because of the differentiation between the cost of fuel at the moment, they are quids in when it comes to their finances their repayments are lower than the difference in the fuel prices. So there may well become an economic driver for a switch that the council will not necessarily have to have any kind of influence over. We also took some advice from external financial advisors, and this was done through the Section 151 officer. And there is caution within the report about some of the options around loans, acting as a guarantor, and the council providing cash grants, and that's set out in paragraphs 537 and 547 of the report. The tax, as we've discussed now, there will be elements of this report that are tied in with the taxi policy, and I've made a note that we will now include on the forward plan an annual review of the greening kind of issues, but specifically around the emissions element of the taxi policy itself. The Section 151 officer has had a look at the report, as have our legal colleagues, and he has reminded me that the prioritisation of any proposals put forward by this committee would need to be considered against other council priorities and the wider financial position that the council faces when it sets its budgets. We're happy to try and answer any questions, and obviously welcome discussion on this matter.
Thank you. I'm sure there will be some. A view from me is that I have great difficulty seeing this council putting itself in a position where it would need to be under the purview of the PRA or the FCA, in effect the Bank of England, becoming a moneylender. It doesn't really quite make sense to go quite that far. Councillor Marsh, you're first up.
Yeah, I was first up about 3 years ago when I first attended this committee, Mr. Chairman. I've been banging on about most of these things, and good to know that we're making progress, and fantastic that there is now an electric cab in West Berkshire. Is that correct? Maura, is that what you just said?
There is. I'm not sure if it's a Hackney carriage or a private hire.
Okay. Well, anyway, good news, and I do think this is a very good report. So thank you, Maura, Jenny, and Sean. Just to get the ball rolling, I'll give you my thoughts very briefly on the various recommendations. I think on pages 109 and 110, I think there should be a fee-based incentive. At point A, I think what Councillor Abbs proposed in his motion for full council seems reasonable, which is half full discount for full electric vehicles and half price, as it were, for hybrids. I don't support the capping because it's too complex, and I think that we should aim for simplicity and try and get something in time for the next budget in 23 to 24. So let's make it reasonably easy and straightforward. 3, the parking, I think, seems reasonable if it's overnight parking in somewhere like, for example, the Kennet Centre, but it would have to be overnight. I can't see that it would be reasonable to other EV vehicle users if it were during the day, but I can't see why, given that they'll be paying for it, for the charging, why somebody who doesn't have the facility to charge at home shouldn't be able to use somewhere like a car park. I think I would favour cash grants, which I'll come back to in a minute, and I agree entirely with the point made by the chairman that going for loaning and going for a fund to then loan from seems to me extremely complicated, and it will take it will not only have the disadvantages that Councillor Cole has mentioned, but also have the effect of slowing down how quickly we can move to this. Whereas I think grants, it costs the council money, but it's a lot simpler, and we see it working well elsewhere, as the report says, in places like Oxford, where you can get £5,000 from the local authority to buy a new vehicle. And if we're looking at something like that and then take into account the fact that the government makes £1,500 available, and there are other possible grants such as conversion for disability use, I think that's the way to go. And it may well be that now they finally realised what we've been saying, which is that there are advantages to doing this. You know, you're not doing the council or the public a favour. It's actually in the interest of the trade to start moving in this direction, not least because there are many customers who would favour using a fully electric or hybrid vehicle and would actually patronise a firm that was offering that service. So it's a really good business move for the trade, in my view, but we need to help them. And this is an excellent way to do so. So that would be how I would go about it and how the Green Group would go about it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Pask.
Chairman, I've long held the belief that a council such as ours should be, and I use my favourite term, an enabling council, not a provider. I don't think it is our position to provide, but I think absolutely, Councillor Marsh, we should enable where possible within our remit. So in line with what you just said, Chairman, I don't think it would be right or proper for us to provide grants for purchase. And as Moira said initially, market forces are working rapidly, and we are all pleased to see that, aren't we? We're all singing off the same hymn sheet, actually, just with slightly different words occasionally. And the commercial sense of buying an electric vehicle, especially with fuel prices as high as they are, I think will drive this anyway. If we can enable that drive to accelerate by assisting with the charging, for example, that would be one thing, but I would not be in favour of finding a budget to provide money to purchase these vehicles.
Either as grant or loan, you're saying?
Small grants maybe to help. And I think, Councillor Marsh, I think sadly you're a little out of date. I fear the 1,500 grant, although I haven't checked it on Google, has just been stopped, unfortunately.
For private use, but not for.
Oh, well, taxes. I stand corrected. Okay, well, thank you for that. I've learnt something tonight, Chairman.
And also, may I just come back and clarify? I think Councillor Cole was referring to the complicated nature of becoming a lending, leasing, funding. Yes. A grant doesn't come into that category. You just give them the money, and you may think that 5,000 is too much, but I mean, a grant is a grant, and it's a pretty simple thing to administer, and it may just encourage people to take that leap into this.
Thank you. Who's next up? Councillor Bridgman.
Thank you, Chairman. I fully agree that we should be encouraging EV. Two comments. Firstly, I do think that market forces are in our favour in that. I certainly, wherever I can, use our electric car rather than my diesel car. Anytime I can use the electric, I use it because it's a damn sight cheaper to run. Having spent a fair amount of money buying the thing, that's the point. They do cost quite a lot above petrol and diesel vehicles to buy. But I don't think that's the issue that the trade has. I think every message we've had from the trade in all of our liaison meetings has been range. Pure EV, everything we hear from the trade is that the range current ranges, and I saw that I think the latest I think it's the TX4 or TX5 electric London cab has a range of about 320 miles. But of course, they're working very much in an urban setting. And that's one of the issues the trade has, particularly not the Hackney carriage trade around the urban areas, but the taxis that go further. So if I look at the proposals in turn, I think we can do something on fees. I do think that there is an argument that says that we incentivize the use of hybrids and EVs, and we do that through our fee system. I really want to see those numbers, but I know that we will not ultimately make that decision. That's a decision for council. Sure. But I do want to see those numbers really bottomed out so that when those numbers really come, we understand the full implication for the budget. I don't agree with capping the cost of rapid charging because, after all, I say that, in fact, anyone will charge if they can. If they can, they will charge because it's a lot cheaper than buying fuel. free parking, I entirely take the point that's been made about overnight access to charging points. I don't think we want to, not clog them up, the wrong phrase, but not restrict them during the day in order to improve the access to EV charging across the district. So I do say that having free access to costed EV charging overnight where it can't be done at home is a very good idea. I think the piece where I really want to get the debate going is this idea of grants. I certainly don't think we should be a lender. I certainly don't think any of that stacks up. I think if we are going to do something on this front, it is to recognise the fact that hybrids and EV cost more than standard, and we want to encourage it. And therefore, there is an element of cash in that process. I think 5,000, given the current climate and given the pressure on the attraction of buying hybrids or EVs, given that the trade has to buy new vehicles on a fairly regular basis, in the current economic climate, it's actually pushing people that way anyway. I would like to give them a nudge in the right direction. I'm not certain 5,000 is a figure, but I await the debate on that. So, Chairman, I'm basically in support of that concept, both the fee remission, if it is remission, fee reduction, and the grant.
And a small grant and restricted free parking. Okay. Councillor Walter.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And likewise, I agree with the broad thrust that members have made. Again, a fee reduction would be a very modest, fairly visible, but very modest enabler nudge by us, given the size of the fee compared with the cost of an electric vehicle. So, in principle, I would be supportive of a reasonable, and obviously there's a huge word in that, grant to further incentivise. I would want to see that grant annually reviewed and with a view to tapering away, just as with new technologies being supported initially, and that support moving away, remembering that, of course, all new vehicles will have to be electric anyway within the next 8 years. So we're looking at a time window, and we want to accelerate, to mix metaphors, uptake by public transport over the next few years. So a time-limited tapering response would be good, I think.
3 years for grants, 3 years for reduced licence fee, 3 years from when you take up that option.
That could be good, Chairman. Yes, and maybe we as a community, just as we're going to review various things each year, as we were saying with the previous item on emissions, we should revisit in the light of the actual market each year to see, are we on course? Do we want to do a bit more, a bit less?
Okay, Councillor Vickers.
Can you hear me? Because I was told I couldn't be heard before. I've turned this on, I think.
I'm not sure your microphone's on.
Well, I should turn it on, unless I'm not plugged in. Well,
bring it a bit closer. Just
it's working. Carry on next time. Yeah, I welcome Councillor Abb's timely motion, important motion, and the point I just wanted to make was, I've got a funny dot.
Come on, use that one. I know it works.
Is this working?
Yeah, that's better.
Right, I don't know what's the matter with that one. Thank you. I welcome Councillor Abb's timely and important motion. And the point I just wanted to make was to do with the overnight charging at the place of residence of our taxi operators. Obviously, many of them will have their cars at home, and we know that we're still looking at finalising some dedicated on-street parking for charging points in our urban areas. I think hopefully this is going to be happening soon, but obviously that's an important aspect of whether or not the drivers are going to be able to charge their cars if they've got nowhere, no drives, etc., to park them in, and charge them, that they need to be able to use the on-street parking spaces, which need to be dedicated to electric vehicles in order that they have access to charging them when they need to. Is that clear? Yeah.
And is that going to the EAG?
It certainly will be discussed at EAG. I'm very confident of that, given the fact it's already been. But in terms of an EAG, as you know, Chairman, is not an official decision-making body. It is an interesting discussion group. It may well come back to executive, but this discussion will, obviously, for those of us, several of us are also members of EAG, this will shape our thinking, I trust, when that comes along.
Okay. Councillor Bridgman.
Legacy hand, Chairman.
Chairman, just to say that the response to the motion has got to go back to the executive. That was what was agreed at council. The more general discussions on greener issues, the taxis and so on and so forth would happen at the EAG.
Do you want a vote out of us on this one?
It would make my life a lot easier going forward if we could just go through each of the recommendations and make sure that members are agreeing quite finite resolutions on those.
Okay. Right, so the recommendations were whether or not to agree that a fee-based incentive, such as that set out in paragraph 5.3, should be introduced in respect to the 23-24 budget. If so, should it be in place for hybrid or fully electric vehicles, the level, how long, and the criteria? You'd like us to do that as one vote based on?
Chairman, there seems to be general agreement in the room that members are quite supportive of going with a fee-based incentive. What I need clarity on is whether or not that's going to apply to electric vehicles and or hybrid vehicles. And I think the suggestion in the room has been that it would be a 100% reduction for a electric vehicle and a 50% for a hybrid vehicle. I think that's what I'm understanding members are saying. I think it's been discussed that we would put this incentive in place for 3 years. I don't know if that's been agreed, or if we'd do it for a year and then come back. And finally, if it comes to the hybrid vehicles, I think we need to apply some sort of criteria to which vehicles would meet that subsidy.
Some sort of criteria.
So
what's a hybrid vehicle?
I've spoken because I know nothing about electric vehicles, Chairman. I have spoken to Jenny Graham about it, and she has had a look around at other authorities. And so if I can just read from what she said, the vehicles should be zero emission capable. This term includes plug-in hybrid vehicles, but sets a minimum distance or range that the vehicle must be able to be driven without any exhaust emissions, as well as a maximum GCO2 per kilometre. In terms of the minimum distance, Jenny has suggested that the vehicles should have CO2 emissions of less than 50 grams per kilometre and be able to travel at least 70 miles or 112 kilometres without any emissions at all.
Okay. Councillor Pask, you're looking worried.
Well, not worried, Chairman. I do try to keep abreast of these things by reading motoring press. And yes, ranges of hybrid vehicles on electric power only is rising all the time, but mainly those more expensive ones. A lot of them are only 30 to 40 miles, I think, at the moment. Now, I know we should incentivise to get the maximum electric range, but I'm just trying to be realistic as well. Certainly at the moment, a lot of vehicles, I understand, and I stand to be corrected, but only do in the region of 30 to 40 miles. And that isn't just the advert, and none of them get up to the range that the manufacturer seems to indicate they should, which is another issue, and especially in winter when they go even fewer miles on electric range only, as I'm sure Councillor Bridgman will ascertain about his Mini. So I don't know where we go with this, Chairman. We're sort of almost plucking a figure out of the air. I think 70 is too high. I think we should be aiming more for, at this stage of development of such vehicles, which are, of course, only an interim measure until fully electric come up, of somewhat less.
Indeed. And are you basing this on the manufacturer's claims?
But then it depends how you drive it, doesn't it, as well? So if you start accelerating away quickly all the time, you use up the juice a lot quicker. So no, I think we've got to base it on manufacturers' claims. But a lot of those certainly are vehicles which are probably more affordable for trade. I don't think you'll get many that are capable of doing 70, but as I say, I do stand to be corrected.
Okay, Sean, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, just a couple of things, Chair. I think going on the point about that Councillor Pask has just raised. I mean, obviously, the technology is changing all of the time, and actually, basically, even within the scope of 1 year of fee setting, the technology is changing quite significantly. So I wonder basically whether what we're looking at is basically kind of just hybrids, effectively, and no emission vehicles. Effectively has been the categories. The second thing I was really just going to ask for clarity at the end of this debate from the committee was that clearly at some point at the next meeting we'll be coming back with some proposals around fees and charges. So I just want to be clear, basically it would help us as officers basically to understand what it is that you would like to see in that in terms of proposals for you to debate. I'm assuming a proposal based on some form of reduction, starting with the point that the fee is the fee. There is a reduction for no emission vehicles. There is a reduction for hybrid low emission vehicles. And then basically a proposal around numbers and period. Is that what we've been asked to produce? Can I just clarify that, Chair?
Yes. The left-hand side of this room. I hope that's not coming from me. What we've come up with is coming from me. No, it's off. Thank you. Right, what we have so far is 100% reduction for electric vehicles, a 50% reduction for hybrids. There's an element of what's a hybrid, which we've still got to define, but what Moira has just read out could be acceptable. Councillor Bridgman wants to comment.
Well, Chairman, I'm just going to point out that the proposal from officers is at 5.30, or has the flesh put on it at 5.30, and that proposal, which is costed, is for the first 10 adopters each year to have this reduction. Now, and we're editing the reduction, so I think that the proposal in the main proposal is for a full reduction for low emission, rather than our suggestion of 100% for full EV and 50% for hybrid. So I just want members to reflect on 5.30 and whether there should be a limit or not to the number of vehicles in the first number of vehicles each year. Now, of course, there, I guess, there's an issue, and I look for officers' guidance as to the dates that fees are paid. In other words, do all vehicles in the fleet, as it were, come up for fees at the same time each year, or is it sort of rolling? Does it depend on when they first came onto the fleet, when they pay these fees? Because it would be rather unfair for someone who came onto the fleet right at the end of the year to miss out because they aren't due to pay their fee until the end of the year. So I'd just like some guidance from officers on that one and interrelated to 5.30.
Do we really need to restrict it to 10 at a point when we're supposed to be encouraging?
Well, I guess my question is what is the potential cost if the entire fleet goes that way?
Yeah. Chair, just picking up on the point on the fees. So the licenses are all for 1 year, Councillor Bridgman, for the vehicles. And obviously the vehicle fee that is charged is at the point at which that license is issued, effectively the effective date of that license. So they do come up throughout the year. There is no kind of general renewal date. They're basically spread pretty evenly throughout the year. I think. Sorry?
I said, Sean, that's part of the question answered.
Yes, no, I was just moving on to the second bit. I mean, clearly, obviously, basically, going on to the point, if everybody had an electric vehicle or basically one of the subsidised licenses, there clearly would be a significant impact. So obviously there is a time-limited nature of this. I'm guessing what the committee is looking at is basically incentivising a general trade shift towards cleaner, greener vehicles, is my understanding of what I'm hearing. There will come a point, of course, based on government targets, that all new vehicles will be electric, at which point basically I'm assuming as a local authority we wouldn't want to have no fees to cover the regime, to cover the licensing regime.
It helps in terms of scale. As of the 1st of April this year, we had 138 private hire and 123 Hackney carriages on the books. So you take that and then multiply it by around £250, that would be the scale of everybody.
So you're looking at about 60 to 70,000 total subsidy.
Anybody being able to buy those in practical terms in the local seems to be rather low. Councillor Walter.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. To enlarge on that point, I would suggest that just as we effectively take a risk in the much bigger area of adult social care, obviously we're obliged by legislation to do that, and we don't really know how many people are going to need or deserve or be paid a course of treatment in a year. Likewise, while we don't know exactly how many people come up who need a new vehicle will actually choose electric, I would suggest that we explicitly do not cap what are indicative figures here. We accept and we ask officers to quantify the risk, budget accordingly, and I would suggest that particularly over the next year, starting March of 23, the actual risk of the financial risk, as it were, to the finance team will be fairly modest. So I do suggest we do not, to your point, Councillor Brisbane, penalise the late person who wants it. We encourage all and as many as keen to take up the offer, and clearly again review year by year.
I imagine that would receive general agreement all round. Okay, so we're on a winner on that one. At what point do you want us to vote on this? Have we reached a point where we could vote?
Chairman, I'm not sure if we actually need to do a vote. If we just keep getting consensus as we're going through, you can, I'd be comfortable with that.
You've got 100%, you've got 50%, you've got no cap on the numbers.
The criteria, I think, is still up in the air. Are we going with no criteria, just hybrid vehicles?
Okay. Are we all happy?
Sorry to be awkward here, Chairman. I would personally like I would like to see a criteria, if only to avoid what has been a period of greenwashing in the vehicle fleet of notional hybrids being flogged off as company car fleets, whereas in reality they're they're petrol cars with a teeny weeny battery. I think there should be a number, and we should ask Jenny's team to refine the things that be done with a view to what is coming next. But I do suggest there should be a criterion.
None of us will want to see greenwashing. Happy on that one? Okay, shall we move on to the next one?
Excuse me, Chair. Sorry to interrupt. Do you still need my attendance?
Sure, we'd always benefit by your attendance. But
That's very kind. But do you require me for anything else on the agenda is really the question I have to ask.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much indeed.
So if we move on to the next one, capping the cost of EV rapid charges for taxis licensed on our network. If so, where the cap should be set.
I think what I've heard from the room on that one is that members are not in favour of that proposal, Chairman.
Happy to agree that? Okay. Whether members would support providing access to free parking?
Again, Chairman, I think the caveat on that one was that it would have to be overnight parking, and that it shouldn't sort of block other people from using them during the daytime.
So as a general principle, I think you've got agreement to that. What is overnight is the question.
Chairman, I think I'd have to take advice from our parking team, who are currently doing a survey around parking as well.
And where is it? Are we talking on street parking as per Martha's, or
where and when to be defined?
Yeah. Okay.
Chairman, some of our car parks are shut at midnight.
Yeah,
one over the road,
one just across the road.
Exactly. So that's going to be a problem for taxi drivers, A, getting in there, especially what time they finish, and B, getting their vehicles out. And they most probably want to go home as well. So it's going to be a challenge. We might have to look at on-street charging, where there are, because we have limits to how much we've got in our current car park anyway at Market Street or Kennett's, whatever it is. Anyway,
that one may not be practical, but there are others that will be practical. We're doing it in principle here, I think, which is quite right as far as that one's concerned. Whether members would support a budget bid to provide cash grants. Views on cash grants, please. £1,000, £2,000. Sorry.
Comes down to budget, doesn't it? I mean, we've got to cost this. Got to know what the likely take up is, depending on the amount, because obviously, the more grant you give, the higher the likelihood of take up is, because it makes the vehicle more attractive and more attractive. And so there's there's an increasing curve here as to likelihood of take up and therefore total cost to the council. I think we have to understand the total cost and get 151 officer viewpoint on the capital, because presumably is going to be a capital cost. The capital cost of the council and the cost of the capitalisation cost of that, and the cost of financing that over the period. So I think it's very difficult just to pluck a number out of the air, isn't it?
Isn't it? Perhaps that this one is then a case of asking officers to come back with a costed proposal.
Chairman, if I may, I think that the intention would be that would be costed going towards the executive meeting, but we didn't want to spend a lot of time costing something when we weren't clear what kind of levels and if members would even support it. That's the understanding I have from Joseph.
Chairman, if I may, I think what we should do at this stage, Councillor Bridge is absolutely right, should not just pluck figures out of the air. We don't know the impact. We are responsible for taxpayers' money, however good a scheme it is, and I do support it in principle. So I think what we should do is give support in principle, ask for a range of options as far as officers are able to give it. So if they were to come up with £1,000, a capital cost would be one figure, 2,000, another figure, 3,000, etc. And then we can make an informed decision rather than pluck figures out of the air, which I think is not the responsible way of going forward.
I entirely agree. And over a period of time. Is that a proposal then?
The other thing, of course, is the uptake. We don't know who's going to take up the option.
I have a proposal from Councillor Pask and a seconder from Councillor Beck. All in favour, please.
Sorry, Chair.
This is the
proposal that we agree in principle to grants, but that we don't agree the amount, because that's going to be costed by officers. But we're agreeing in principle to the idea of a grant.
Yes. All in favour? Thank you. Right, whether members would support a budget bid to purchase electric vehicles, which would then be loaned to the trade. My feeling from earlier on that is not a goer. Correct. So I'm going to count that as no unless anybody is violently objecting. I don't think they are. That's not a goer. Likewise, a budget bid to set up a fund so that the council could act as a lender to the trade to purchase electric vehicles. That's in the same bucket. I would add, however, that if this council was able to come up with a proposal via a professional lender, perhaps in conjunction with other councils, I, for one, would be interested to hear that. But only if a professional lender were involved.
Which goes back to my point of enabling, Chairman. Yes. We should be an enabling authority.
Yes. Correct. Right. Those are... Is that something we should explore with the vehicle leasehold or leasehold? What did you come this about? Did you hear what I was saying? Not entirely, Councillor. Right. I'm just putting it forward for consideration, taking up on the point that there are professional companies very experienced in leasing cars to business in the area. Is it worthwhile the officers actually having some words with these people to see if there is any scope for cooperation, not only with this council, but maybe one or two other local councils as well, to bring about benefits of quantity? That would seem to be a very good idea, Councillor Odwalter.
Sorry to be a bit of a wet blanket here, councillors, but I would sooner, given the demands of time on officers, say no to that. And the reason being that there is, as you say, Councillor Beck, there's a very well-developed, mature and sophisticated vehicle purchasing, leasing industry in this country. Most new cars, almost all new cars, are leased in any case. And we as a small council, even if we were a big council, we should not be in that game. We should, as the trade knows, point them to the players both locally and nationally who are more than capable of doing this. We have enough things in terms of officer time to be doing ourselves.
Yes. I'm not suggesting that we should take it on ourselves, but taking up what Councillor Pask said, working in conjunction with these people to actually make it known. I mean, you're aware of this. I'm sure that not every sort of taxi owner or driver is totally familiar with the possibilities which are available to them. And I'm just suggesting we actually bring these people together in some way or other.
Well, again, sorry, I'm slightly damp on the idea, but there we are.
I can only repeat then that, well, we clearly don't have a full agreement here, but I certainly would want to see something, if it's just in the line of enabling, to push the owner drivers that are not part of major groups, that don't have the advantage of understanding necessarily the financing. There may be some mileage in that. If we can act as enablers, that would make sense. But that's my view. We weren't asked to vote on that one. What we were asked to vote on, I believe Councillor Drummond must be leaving us. All right, thank you. Maury, you want us to vote on 548?
Chairman, I think I've got a clear steer on those first few ones. I think the next thing is just, 548 is the only one left is on the, that's the proposal that's going to go back to the executive. But I think we've been quite clear, because you've said that you do support a fee reduction. Those are the two elements of the motion. There were two elements to it.
Part one is covered.
Yeah, part two is around the charging points, and the response that officers have provided is that they are looking at charging points in the round. They are looking to install 25 in car parks this financial year. So looking at specific ones for taxis, they'll look at where they can use dual opportunities, but they don't necessarily have the time to fully engage just looking at the taxi ones this year. That's
If
what
you'd
I
like a
understand from
proposal that the committee would go along with that, I believe the committee would be in favour of that. Councillor Pask, you're looking very worried.
Just if it brings any reassurance to members, they are doing some feasibility studies, and the feasibility studies are going back to the EAG in November.
So are we in favour of those feasibility studies?
Always in favour of feasibility studies, Chairman. I'm not in favour of plucking figures out the air without the professional advice.
Happy with that.
Chairman.
Councillor.
Are you saying, Moira, that this proposal is with internal car parks, or is it also externally parking outside our car parks? Because our car parks get shut generally at midnight.
Chairman, all we're talking about here is the two elements of the motion that went to the January council meeting. So there were two elements to that motion. The first one was to introduce subsidised incentive scheme within next year's budget, and I think members have agreed to that. And the second element of the motion was to provide, where practicable, fast charging points next to taxi ranks to remove range anxiety for taxi drivers. And as I've said, officers are looking at undertaking infrastructure and feasibility surveys for the taxi ranks, and they'll be taking a proposal back to the Environment Advisory Group in November. So in terms of that one, it would be let's look at the feasibility studies before we actually make a determination.
I take it that includes on street rather than just in a car park, which we currently have at the moment.
Yes, it'll be four taxi ranks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Right, are we in favour of
sorry, I was
that
going
as
to say,
it
Chairman, that
stands?
if you read 548, it's explicit about relating to taxi ranks in addition to car parks, but makes the point that officers are going to be somewhat hard pressed because of the number of charging points they're going to want to be putting into a large number of car parks across the district. So, you know, let's be practical about the bandwidth of officers here.
But that 548 part 2 is not terribly specific. as far as I read that, it is reasonable for this committee to say, please keep going and report back to us. We happy with that?
Yes.
Okay. Sean.
Yeah, Chairman, just to say that in relation to both access to grants and access to things like charging points, I think as a service we also need to go away and have a look at the grants that may be available through other routes for installation of these things. So, for example, there is a bidding round every year with DEFRA for air quality grants as one of the options we could look at. And also in terms of the grants that are available to the taxi trade as well, basically the private hire trade to move to EVs. And as part of the strategy, really keep up to date with that and keep them informed basically as to where they can apply for those grants. I think that's very important as well. Because again, there seems to be new grants coming online on a fairly regular basis or adjustments to the grant systems that are available. I've just circulated one now actually basically, which is the government's plug-in. I think it's described as the plug-in taxi grant eligibility and applications, which was only updated on the 30th of June, which suggests grants there of up to £7,500 towards a new vehicle, depending on the emissions output. So I think as part of the overall strategy, we need to look at all of that.
We look forward to hearing more, I think. Councillor Vickers, we need to move on to the next agenda item.
Yeah, I don't put my, oh, no, I don't put my hand up, sorry.
Ah.
Being round down here, that was a mistake, sorry.
In which case, I think we should move on because we are a little behind time. Statutory consultation on Hackney carriage tariffs. Moira, is that for you?
Yeah, that would be me, Chairman. We've been approached by the taxi trade.
Sorry, I'd hate to interrupt. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I need to go.
Thank you for your time. Right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Moira.
Chairman, we've been approached by the taxi traders. Members will be aware we review the taxi fares annually. Normally they go to the taxi liaison group in January. We come to this committee in July and then go to the executive in September. Taking on board Councillor Bridgman's point earlier about potentially just going straight from the taxi liaison group to the executive and just reporting back to the licensing committee. There's two sort of proposals on the table. One around a 5% increase and one around an 8% increase. If members are minded to support a 10% increase, we can also do the work around that one and take it back to, and that will be discussed at the executive who will make a decision this Thursday evening. We have consulted the taxi trade informally. The numbers were very, very close. We got 48 responses. Of those, 3 people didn't really want to see an increase, one of them wanting to delay until the taxi policy was in place. We had 23 in favour of a 5% uplift and 22 in favour of a 10% uplift, which is the reason why we produced an 8%, which was as close as I could get to a 7.5% middleman. As I said, though, if members think that a 10% option would be better, both options would have each additional mile costing £2.60. The difference between the two is around the flag charge and putting the flag charge up to £5. It's not a like-for-like comparison, though. The maths around these, as Councillor Bridgman will know, is complicated. But the £5 flag would give people a distance of 1,460, I think it is, miles, as opposed to 415 before the clock started ticking again. The trade would be in favour of the second option, the £5, primarily because a lot of people are paying by card now, and it would probably just make it easier for them around card payments. They're not taking that much cash. That's all that I have really to say. The other thing that we're looking at potentially is introducing a filing charge, which hasn't previously appeared on the table of fares. Members may wish to take a view on the proposal. That you may think that comparatively those numbers are quite high. The filing charge is made up really of 2 elements. The first element being the cost of having the car cleaned, and the second element, the loss of revenue when the vehicle is not able to operate. I guess there's a vast difference between somebody having some sort of an accident in the car on a Monday morning when they could just zip around to the local garage and get their car cleaned and be back on the road in a relatively short period of time. If it's a Saturday night when it's a peak period, they're earning lots of money and they're off the road for a longer period of time, you may take a view that a slightly higher number is valid, but up to members really to have a discussion around that. We've also made a slight tidying up because on the existing policy, there's talk around timings changing at 10 o'clock. Where you kind of need the sort of the minute before and the minute after. So they're sort of slightly more specific in terms of that wording.
Okay, can we deal with this in two parts? The basic changes firstly and the fouling secondly. Comments please from members.
If I may, Chairman, can I just clarify, because I understand the concept, I just want to clarify the value. What is the proposed flag distance in option 2, the 8% uplift? Because I can see that it's much longer than it currently is, because obviously it only goes from £5 flag to £5.40 at the end of the first mile. So just to understand what the new flag distance is.
So the flag distance will be 1,489. So it's about 10 out of 12, 11 out of 13 units. Okay. In that sort of sense.
And what isn't in the proposal is tariffs 2 and 3. Is the proposal to increase tariffs 2 and 3 proportionally to tariff 1?
So it's the same principle that we had before, 1.5,
okay.
2 times.
Then so far as the tariffs are concerned, Chairman, and you appreciate I've been involved in this somewhat, I think that the halfway house between the 5% and the 10%, given the sort of split in the trade and the proposal at 8% is about the right one. So option 2, with those changes to other tables, I think that is the way I would personally go with this. I don't know if you want to deal with the tariffs first and the founding charge second. I've got a view on the founding charge, and I think we've exchanged an email on it. But
I suggest we come back on the founding charge. Councillor.
Well, Councillor Bridgman's concurred with sort of my view. I think the 8% is a fair assumption, especially based on the responses that we've got. And I very much support that, Councillor Bridgman. I'll hold fire on the other issue at the moment.
Okay. Councillor Adewalt has put his hand down. Do we have any other comments on that?
I agree, Chairman.
Okay, then let's go back to fouling.
Well, if I may, Chairman, my recollection, I think that the London cabs, and I indirectly have some experience of this, having had a daughter who managed to give birth in a black cab on the Euston Road, is that it is currently £60 for interior cleaning of a cab. That's to obviously reflect the cost of cleaning and the amount of time the cab's off the road. And that probably is an underestimate of actually what it costs, but they've obviously got to put a charge against it. I think I suggested interior 75, and I can't remember what I've suggested on exterior was 15, I think, perhaps, but you'll remind me, no doubt. But that I
can't remember without looking it up.
I know we've had this.
What's it cost to go to a car wash and get that sort of thing done?
Well, that's the question.
Probably more than £15.
Car valet is around 40 quid because I do that from time to time.
Well, £40 for a... It's not a bucket of water, it is time off the road. A £40 fee would seem to be reasonable for...
Chairman, the other issue obviously is in London is that they're probably more likely to be able to access some sort of a late night cleaning service than you would be in rural Berkshire.
Chairman, there's quite a lot of delays in, sorry not to put my hand up, there's quite a lot of delays in people actually using a proper car wash, that cleans up underneath, because that's important in winter, with getting the salt off. But yeah, you're talking in the Meadway in Reading, it's around the top notch external cleaning. It's about 15 quid. If you want a hand wipe and all the rest of it, then it's going to cost you money. And obviously there is also wax marks and all the rest of it. So it depends how much you want to do. But in terms of the interior, if somebody has actually vomited in a vehicle, that smell can be quite overpowering, very difficult to clean with interiors and all the rest of it. It's going to linger and it's going to put people off using a taxi. So it is a problem as such, and it's also the time and the element and also getting it. At the moment, there's huge queues there in the Meadway in Honey End Lane, just using that service. And there's no automated services, I don't believe, in Newbury, but in Reading Borough, there's a lot of problems there. The other alternative is just go to a supermarket car wash and go through it. It depends what you want for the external ones. So I think £75 is more than generous of somebody fouling a vehicle because they're drunk.
So you're, rather than the 150 proposed, you are both suggesting £75.
Well, that was my suggestion, because that goes along with Wokingham, we've got to charge 75.
What's Bracknell planning?
I can't remember the table.
Bracknell, £50 for interior, 10 for exterior.
I think £50 is a bit low.
It is too low, Chairman.
All right, can we have a proposal then on £75 and how much?
Shall I go £75 interior, £25 exterior, Chairman? How does that sound to everyone?
Seconded.
Seconded. All in favour? And we'll be putting this to the taxi trade later this month anyway.
Chairman, the proposal will go to the executive, and then the executive will make a determination whether that they're happy to go out to consult or not. The other element to pick up then is on around the consultation period, and if members want to consult for the statutory 14 days, or if you would like to extend the consultation period to 28 days as you did before.
28 days?
So this is consultation on tariffs as well. And given that we went through a fairly sizable, this is an increase to reflect vehicle, this is to reflect fuel costs, really. All right, the fouling charge is a different issue. So therefore, I think it's A, urgent, and B, effectively, we've already done the work on getting a new table of tariff to replace what went, I think it was going back to 2013, the previous one. So I think the work's been done on the raison d'etre. I think this is simply on a percentage increase to reflect fuel. I think 14 is urgent. I think 14 is fine.
We go along with 14 days then.
Second, Chairman.
All in favour? Thank you. Right. Annual report.
Chairman, the annual report is set out in the committee papers. It reflects the work of the licensing committee, the licensing subcommittee, and also the work of the service. I'm happy to take any questions, more likely that Julia is actually going to be able to answer them than I am, but the information is there and the report is to note only.
Seemed a good report. Members, questions, please. No questions then.
But can I thank officers, as usual, thank officers for the effort that's gone into this.
Absolutely.
Indeed. Good report, as you said, Chairman.
Thank you. In which case, forward plan, I made my comment about looking at the green side again in 12 months' time. Do we have any other comments to make? In which case, duly noted And if we have no other business, we'll close the meeting. Thank you. Sorry it's taken so long.